Life can get pretty stormy sometimes, especially in the last few years. There's been a lot of stormy activity in our world, and sometimes those storms come up fast. You're not sure exactly what to do, and you're not really even sure how it happened. It leaves you wondering, questioning, what happened? How did I get here? And how do I make sense of my life? That's what I want to talk to you about today on The Well.
And now, Dr. David Swanson.
It is so interesting how quickly things can change in our lives. Right now, it's a beautiful day where I am, and yet within a matter of minutes, a storm could blow in. It could happen so quickly. When I was a younger man, I was about 25 years old. I lived in Dallas, and I was working for a computer company. And it was one of those jobs where you had to wear a suit and a tie every day. And I'd gotten off work about 5 o'clock, and I could tell in Dallas it was one of those days where a big thunderstorm was rolling in. And I had to meet a friend of mine at church. I was doing some volunteer work there, and I went to the church, and he came driving up in his car. And he's on the driver's side, and he rolls down the window on the passenger side, and I've got my hands on his car, and I lean in to talk to him. And as I'm talking to him, I can hear the thunder pealing in the background. Lightning is flashing, and I'm not feeling too excited about being out there, but I didn't want to walk in. And so as I'm leaning in the car, all I remember is a flash of light. And the next thing I remember, I am flat on my back, looking up, and my friend is leaning out of the passenger side window of his car, and he's going, "David, are you okay? Are you okay?" And I'm lying on the ground, it's raining, I'm in a suit and tie, and I'm thinking to myself, what happened? How did I get here? And I had no feeling in my arms below my elbows or in my legs below my knees. They're just all tingly and numb. And I thought, my goodness, I've been hit by lightning. Well, as it turned out, he put me in his car, he drove me to a fire station about a block away, and the paramedics looked me over, and I had no exit wounds. So what they said was a bolt of lightning had most likely hit the ground about a block away, and the electricity had run through the street and come up and hit me in my feet, and then come up through the car and hit me in my hands and had knocked me down. And I think in life there are many things like that, where something happens and it just leaves you somewhat bewildered. You know, what happened? I don't know about you and what you think of the recent passage of a health care bill, but I knew it had passed the night before, and so I woke up and I got my newspaper out because I just wanted to know what happened. And even in the newspaper the morning after, there were a lot of people who weren't sure exactly what had happened. How many people had read that bill? Maybe you got diagnosed with a sudden illness, and one day you think your life's fine, the next day all of a sudden you've been diagnosed with this, and it leaves you wondering, what happened? How did I get here? Well, we are now in the season of Easter, and you would have to be fairly hidden and isolated to not hear something about Easter, something about this belief that some people have that a man rose from the dead after 3 days. And I think anybody with a reasonable level of intelligence is going to say to themselves, well, what happened? Did that happen? And many times, and I know people are well-intentioned, if you are someone who is not sure about Jesus Christ or Christianity, and you hear that, you might find a Christian person would say to you, you know, I just know that Jesus lives in my heart, and I accepted Christ, and so I have faith. And I think those people are very well-intentioned, but for many of us, and I think I'm probably the same way, I know I'm that way in my faith, you want something that stands up to intellectual scrutiny. You want something that has the power of intellectual veracity that would stand up in a court of law. There's a sense I want you to prove this to me. And so as we think about faith, What I find is there are many people who would say, you know what, I don't find the things that are said about the resurrection of Jesus, I don't find those plausible. And yet, most people have never actually investigated it. They've never actually asked the questions other than to say, no, I don't think that's true. But while I'm fine with that, if that's what you happen to believe, I don't believe in the resurrection, that's fine. I have no problem with that. But I think you should at least be able to explain to me your position. Can you defend that? Explain to me why you don't think the resurrection is true. Have you investigated it? When I was a little boy in my house, my mother always wanted to serve peas for dinner. And I hated peas. I would come home from school and I'd walk into my house and the whole house would smell of peas, and it would almost make me nauseous. To this day, the smell of peas makes me feel kind of sick. And so I'd come in and the peas would be on my plate and I'd say, Mom, I'm not eating that. And then she would ask me this question, and I had to be truthful. She'd say, David, you say you don't like peas. Have you ever tried them? And unfortunately, I'd have to say, no, I never actually have. They just don't smell good. I'm not about to put one in my mouth. And you know, the same thing is true in our Christian faith. There are a lot of people who say, no, I don't believe that. And then my next question is, well, have you investigated it? Have you tried it? Can you give me an intellectual reason for why you disagree? And the answer often is, well, it just doesn't make any sense. They actually don't have anything behind their statement that they don't believe in the gospel. So what I want to talk to you about today is just a simple question. What happened? If there's even a reasonable chance that it's true, that a human being who said he was God rose from the dead, if there's even a possibility that that's true, then that could actually change your life. Don't you think that's worthy of your investigation? And there are people these days who've written books, people like Richard Dawkins, fairly famous atheist, who says, you have to be an intellectual idiot to believe in Christian faith. Well, at the end of an interview that Richard Dawkins conducted with Ben Stein said, well, how do you prove the fact that we got here to begin with? Because see, one of our natural laws says that you can't get something from nothing. Intellectually, that's a law. You know that's true. So how do you explain that we exist? How did the world come into existence unless there was a creator? And Richard Dawkins, renowned scientist, turns to Ben Stein and he says, well, I think that aliens may have come to the earth and planted the seed of humanity. And Ben Stein kind of looks at him and says, really? You believe that aliens planted a seed on earth more than you believe that there could be a creator who created human beings and that they've come into existence at the hand of that creative force. And he chose to believe that aliens might have done it first. So even in the intellectual world, there are a lot of questions out there. And all I'm asking you to consider, you don't even have to necessarily believe the Bible is true today. I'm just talking about historical, academic, scholastic fact. The disciples lived and breathed. Nobody doubts that. Jesus Christ lived, walked the earth. Nobody debates that. There's no intellectual debate about whether or not Jesus really lived. No one is trying to figure out whether or not that's true. The only question is, what happened? What happened at the cross? In the season of Easter, what happened at the empty tomb exactly? And if we choose to not believe it, then what are the reasons for that? What evidence do we have that it's not true? When we come back, we'll explore a little bit about the evidence surrounding the cross and the empty tomb of Jesus Christ and whether or not that holds up to intellectual scrutiny.
The Well brings a message of hope and refreshment each week to a thirsty world. Hosted by Dr. David Swanson, The Well is more than a television program. It's a multimedia ministry outreach. Drinkfromthewell.com is where you can submit prayer requests, watch past programs, join our email list, and learn more about Jesus. If you would like to partner with this exciting media ministry, please visit our website to find out how you can be a part of The Well.
And now, back to Dr. David Swanson.
We've been talking about the nature of the resurrection. This time of year, there's a lot of conversation about the fact that Jesus rose from the dead. Well, what do we make of that? What do we think? Is that true? Is it not? And if it is, what's the evidence for that? And have we ever really thought through it? So I want to just ask a few questions with you today and think a little bit about the veracity of the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Let me set the scene for you a little bit. In John chapter 20, and then also in the first chapter of the book of Acts, what we find is a group of disciples who are absolutely defeated. Their leader has been crucified and killed. One of their own, somebody who was a friend of theirs, Judas, he's taken his own life and sort of betrayed the whole operation. Then Peter, another one of the leaders in the group, he's also denied that he has any association with Jesus. And so now they're gathered in an upper room, and they're as down as you can imagine. They are completely defeated, and the only thought in their mind is, how do we avoid the same fate that Jesus experienced? They don't want that to happen to them. But here's the interesting thing that you have to come up with some explanation for. 49 days later, those same disciples who are defeated and lost and discouraged, they're now out in the community and they're talking about the resurrection of Jesus. So as you and I look at the evidence for that, how do you explain that? And you can stand back and say, well, okay, let me come up with a few reasons. Well, they were doing it because it was going to make them wealthy. They thought that if they were in the Jesus Club, that was going to be a real good thing for them. No, they were afraid that the people who were opposed to Jesus would in fact arrest them and take their lives in the same way they had the life of Jesus. So it wasn't for wealth. The same thing could be said of fame or power. If you look at the evidence, what could have possibly caused the disciples to go from being scared and alone and discouraged to 49 days later being out among the people boldly sharing this? I believe the only evidence that points to it as an explanation for that behavior is they saw the resurrected Jesus. I don't think there's any other way that you can explain that. In a court of law, you're standing before a judge, what would you say? They go through this radical change in behavior. My explanation is they saw the resurrected Jesus. Can you come up with a meaningful explanation as to why their behavior changed that didn't involve the resurrection? All right, so let's go a step further than that. How do you explain the resurrection appearances of Jesus? Now, there are certain scholars and academicians who say, well, you explain the fact that people saw the resurrected Jesus, this man in glorified form, because they were so committed to Jesus. They were so invested in Jesus. They were so emotionally distraught that essentially they hallucinated it. They just had a vision of Jesus because they just so deeply wanted it to be true. But let me talk to you about that for a second. There was nothing in Jewish tradition that would have ever suggested to them that a resurrection was even possible. They weren't anticipating that Jesus was going to come back. So I think to say, well, emotionally, they just created it in their mind that he rose again, that would not have even been a thought mentally or emotionally in their head that he would come back. And then you have to consider some other things. He didn't just appear to one person. He appeared to hundreds of people. And in particular, when he appeared to the disciples, you know, they're out one night, they've caught some fish, they're having dinner, and the resurrected Jesus appears. And you say, okay, well, if it's a hallucination, are the same people who are sitting there together going to hallucinate exactly the same thing at the same time? And then you stand back and say, okay, well, do hallucinations eat? How do you explain the fact that there was some fish there and now it's gone? What about the fact that when the disciples were gathered together in a room, Jesus appeared to them, kind of came through the wall, and they all saw it together. Thomas was able to reach out and touch his side. He put his hand in the wound in Jesus' side, and yet it was not a physical body. He was still able to come through the wall. So it's this unique, glorified form that's hard for us as human beings to understand. And you say, okay, they all saw it together. Now, you may disagree with that, and it's fine if you do, but you still have to answer the question, how do you explain that? How do you explain that there were so many eyewitnesses to it? You know, here's an interesting thought. I could tell you right now, I was the greatest basketball player in the history of my high school. And I could make a compelling case with you as to why that's true. The problem with that is that there are many members of my high school basketball team who are still living. And in fact, some of them watch this show and right now they're laughing because they know that's absolutely not true. So if there were people who were just trying to make up the resurrection appearances of Jesus, there were so many eyewitnesses around that if someone had said something that wasn't true, those eyewitnesses would have immediately said, that's false. I can reveal to you, I can show you why that's not true. But just the sheer number of eyewitnesses lends credibility and veracity to the statements that Jesus are making. Jesus was making his appearances. So again, all we do in any situation in life is we say, here's our hypothesis, here's our theory, what's the evidence for that? And based on that evidence, we make a decision as to whether or not it's true. We do that all the time. And all I'm asking you to do is to do the same thing. Consider, here's our statement, Jesus Christ rose from the dead. All right, what do we do with these questions? How do we explain the change in the behavior of the disciples? How do we explain the resurrection appearances? What's the evidence of that? Much of what I have spoken to you about today is in a book I've written called Vital Signs. And I'd like to give you some information about how you can access this book and begin to put some of those principles to work in your life. Here's our announcer to tell you how to do that.
Many Christians are spiritually surviving, but they're not growing. They're breathing, but their heartbeat is faint. If this sounds like it could be you or someone you love, here's what the doctor ordered. Vital Signs, the new book by Dr. David Swanson, will show you the way to a powerful, healthy Christian life that can stand up to the test of temptation, stress, and time. Vital Signs can lead you back to a strong and healthy walk with Jesus Christ. And isn't that just what you're looking for?
Our ministry exists to try to serve you in the hope of Jesus Christ. So I would love to hear from you. Send me an email or a letter and let me know how I can be in prayer for you or what needs you may have. It would be our honor to serve you in this ministry.
And now, back to Dr. David Swanson.
We've been talking about the evidence for the resurrection, and I'd like to look at two more questions. The first is, what happened to the body of Jesus? How do you explain the empty tomb? Intellectually, academically, nobody debates that Jesus Christ was crucified, that they took him off the cross and they put him in a tomb. There's no debate about that. The only debate is, what happened to the body? It disappeared. And so you say, all right, how do I explain that? Well, you could say, first, well, the Roman soldiers took it. That they moved the stone in the middle of the night, they took the body. And you say, okay, well, how much sense does that make? Does it make sense intellectually that Roman soldiers would take a body to perpetuate the very myth that they were trying to put down? They were trying to show the people that he wasn't the king of the Jews. So that really doesn't make any sense. Then you say, well, the disciples took it. The disciples took it to show everyone that he rose from the dead. Well, how much sense does that make? Does it make sense to you that the disciples would steal the body to perpetuate a myth that Jesus Christ rose from the dead, and they would take that myth with them, that lie, to the grave, when that lie only brought them untold suffering, persecution, pain, and eventual death? You look at every one of the lives of the disciples, and they all died horrible deaths in the name of their faith. Do all of them go to the grave and die in a painful way for something that's not true? Intellectually, that doesn't really make any sense. There's some who say that, well, when they took Jesus down from the grave, he wasn't really dead. or down from the cross. He wasn't really dead. They put him in there and he was still had a heartbeat, and all the people who prepared the body and put him in the grave, they didn't really notice the fact that he was still breathing, that he had just a little bit of a heartbeat, and so they stick him in the tomb, and he's been beaten within an inch of his life. All the flesh is off his back. He's had tremendous blood loss, but somehow he's going to lay there with poor ventilation, no food or water, and in 3 days regain the strength to push the stone away and run away so that people think he's been raised from the dead. Intellectually, does that really make much sense? No. And so you stand back from it and say, the preponderance of the evidence points you to the fact that Jesus really did rise from the dead. You're in a court of law. How do you explain that? And you can come up with all kinds of different explanations, but they don't make much sense other than what Christians affirm during this season of Easter, that Jesus rose from the dead. There's another interesting thing about it that I want to bring to your attention, and that is the fact that the women were the ones who found the empty tomb. Keep in mind, in those days, women had no standing. Men were everything. Women had no rights. They were barely above the level of a slave. So if I'm going to create a worldwide religious movement based on the fact that somebody rose from the dead, I'm not going to start it out by having the lowest people in the society discover it, and by discovering it, essentially humiliate the men. Do you remember the fact that there weren't any men at the empty tomb? There weren't very many men at the cross. All the disciples left. They were afraid, and they raise up the women to say, oh, we're the ones who went to the tomb. We found there wasn't anybody, and they run back and tell the men. So they make all the men look really bad, just the fact that they have the women described as being the ones who found the empty tomb lends veracity to its truth, because nobody in their right mind would have had anyone but men discover that truth. But Christianity says, no, it was the women. So here's the question that I want you to consider today. In light of the evidence, I hope I've at least planted a seed in you that, gosh, maybe this is true. If it is true, does that have any relevance to my life? Well, let me ask you, is there any relevance for you that there may be a God who has created the heavens and the earth, and in fact created your life, loves you, and has a reason for your existence? Is that relevant to you? Is it important to you that there may actually be an explanation of Jesus Christ lived, was crucified, died, and rose again? Is it relevant to you that actually helps us understand what's wrong with the world? That evil does exist, that sometimes we run into sin, that there's something wrong with us, that we need a Savior. Is it relevant